First, I would like to announce for those of you who do not already know that we're being taped by C-SPAN today. It is not airing live, and we don't know yet when it will run, but we're very happy to have C-SPAN here. We've heard so far in this conference some rather amazing evidence, which I feel strongly indicates, overwhelmingly indicates, the existence of shots from more than one location, which means a conspiracy. But there is a dissenter here who wanted an opportunity to express a dissenting point of view, and that is Dr. Ken Ron from the University of Rhode Island. He will now give his talk on the harmony of the physical evidence.
Thank you very much, Jim. I'd like to begin by offering my appreciation to Jim Lazar and the organizing committee for giving me a chance to discuss with you for a half an hour or so the neutron activation analysis and the power of this in looking into the assassination through a different lens than... No. Is this one? This one? This one? Oh, here it is. It's over here. Okay, thank you. I want to look at the assassination with you in a little different way. During the last couple of days, one of the speakers alluded to it yesterday, I believe, that there's been a lot of confusion, there's been a lot of conflicting evidence. And I think that's a natural result of the type of evidence that's being discussed and the type of evidence that's discussed primarily at these JFK conferences. But there's another way to look at the assassination, and that's through the lens of the hard physical evidence, the validated physical evidence. So I was sitting in the back the other day, I was thinking, thank goodness for the physical evidence, and thank goodness for the neutron activation that organizes the physical evidence. And this is what I'd like to show you in the next half an hour or so. My talk is entitled The Harmony of the Physical Evidence. The major physical evidence, major types of physical evidence are listed here. I can't discuss them all today. Rifle, bullets and fragments, neutron activation, cartridge cases, fingerprints, brown paper bag wounds, clothing, etc., etc. You all know these types of evidence. The physical evidence makes, when combined, a physical framework, a strong web that might better be called an impregnable wall. The neutron activation knits it all together. According to the words of my co-author, Larry Sturtevant, famed ballistician from HSCA days, the neutron activation is truly the queen of the physical evidence. It is the strongest physical evidence, the strongest new physical evidence to emerge from the HSCA hearings. Let me just quickly review with you the bullets and fragments. This is, by neutron activation, we mean chemical analysis of the 5 major bullets and fragments that were recovered from the crime scene and from the hospital. They're listed here. I think you all know them. The ones in light blue are the ones that do not contain lead, and so we're not talking about. But the 5 lead fragments, very briefly, are Q1, the bullet from the stretcher in the hospital, a core plus a jacket. Q2, a fragment from the front seat cushion, core plus jacket. Q4 and 5, Q lead fragments from JFK's head. Q9, 3 fragments from Connolly's arm, and Q14, 3 fragments from the rear carpet underneath Mrs. Connolly's seat. This is a little diagram of where they came from, and I think everybody in the room is familiar with this. So we will go on. These fragments were analyzed chemically 3 times, actually. The first time overnight on the night of the assassination by the FBI, by optical emission spectroscopy. That failed because the technique was too coarse. They then turned to neutron activation, which was a technique coming into its own in those days. It was done first, it was done twice by neutron activation, first by the FBI in May 1964 for the Warren Commission, not publicized. It contained multiple systematic errors that Vincent Gwynne later discovered and resolved. The data were kept secret by the FBI, presumably because there was confusion as to what they actually meant. They did not, as seen then, show a clear story. Then for the HSCA in 1977, Dr. Vincent P. Gwynne of UC Irvine reanalyzed the fragments. This work, in contrast to the first set of analyses, was highly publicized, showed two clear groups of fragments, and ultimately agreed with the FBI's analysis. The goal of this work was very simple and limited. It was to try to determine how many bullets hit the men by seeing whether the little fragments, the tiny fragments too small to have ballistic engravings, could be associated chemically with the larger ballistically engraved fragments. The result of this, as I will show in great detail, are two clear groups of fragments, each containing one big fragment and one or two little ones. This is positive evidence for two and only two bullets, both fired from Oswald's rifle. This is one of the strongest results from any of the physical evidence. Here's the summary of the FBI's original analysis and Gwynne's follow-up analysis. The FBI's data consisted of 4 replicate runs, and you can see the arrows pointing to them. Gwynne's analysis, a decade later, is the black squares in the middle. Now you see essentially 5 parallel lines here, 5 groups. The idea is you have to look horizontally laterally across each analysis, and you will see Q1 and Q9 on the left, which form a group at about, well, according to Gwynne's measurements, about 800 parts per million of antimony. This is the prime indicator element. And then you will see a group on the right containing 3 fragments, Q2, Q4, 5, and Q14. The group on the left is from the body shot. The group on the right is from the headshot. The point is, 2 analyses separated by more than a decade agreed with one another. They each gave 2 groups. The next question, a very important one, is, are these groups distinct from one another? There are 4 ways to check this distinctness, and if we had time, and maybe in the questions we can go into this a little bit more. By the way, I'm going to solicit lots of questions from the audience today because we have an unusual opportunity here of interested people gathered together, and I want to make sure everybody leaves this room with a good basic understanding of what's going on here about the neutron activation and its power. So when I finish, I will take whatever questions you have on this, and I hope that you will leave with a good idea of what's going on. There are 4 ways to check the distinctness of the groups, the separateness of the groups. Number 1, just look at the samples. Number 2, look at the means and the standard deviations. These are increasingly complex. Number 3, test the difference of means statistically. And number 4, Larry Sturtevant, general linear model analysis. If we just look at this, just look at the samples. Here they are from Gwynne's results, which is probably the best set of analysis on this. The group on the left represents the body bullet, the stretcher and the wrist fragments. The group on the right represents the head bullet. You see the values are in the little circles, and you see 95% confidence limits. That's 2 standard deviations, the arrows up and down from there. The groups are separate. You can just see it. If you want to go a little farther, you can look at the means and the standard deviations of the fragments within each of the groups. When you do this, if you take the log scale here for doing this, and we'll show why we do that in a moment, here you see the top group and the lower group, and you see the means differ, and the standard deviations on each one. The means differ by 8 standard deviations. That huge. The groups are separate. If you want to go a little farther, you can test the significance of the means. In order to do that, you have to find the underlying distribution of the concentrations of antimony in Mannlicher-Carcano bullets in general. The way you do that is to use a set of 14 test bullets that Vincent Gwynne got from each of the 4 lots of Mannlicher-Carcano bullets that were manufactured by Western Cartridge Company. You first examine these for a normal distribution. This is standard statistical practice. When you do that, you put on a normal plot. If they are normally distributed, the points, each point represents a bullet here, will lie on a straight line. They don't. They fall off at the low end. This is not, the distribution is not normal. That shouldn't surprise anybody. Most things in nature are log normally distributed. We see this in almost anything in the real world is distributed logarithmically, not linearly. If we try a log normal distribution, which is the standard statistical practice, next step from there, voila, we get a straight line. So to a good first approximation, these Mannlicher-Carcano bullets, the antimony, at least the prime indicator element here, is distributed log normally. I will come back to this point in the second half of the talk. It's a very important point. We know the underlying distribution. There is a single underlying distribution. We now can do statistical tests on it. Oh, and by the way, the red points, here's the same 14 test bullets and the two red dots in the upper right represent the two groups of fragments from the assassination, and you see they fall within the range of the others. There's nothing special about these two groups of fragments from the assassination. We go to test the means, and if you look at the bottom here, you will see that there is less than 3 parts in 1,000 chance that the means are the same. They're different. The same for the third time now. If we do it with a normal distribution instead of log normal distribution, get the same thing, less than 3 chances in 1,000 that the means are the same, so they are different. Larry Sturtevant, master's degree in statistics, co-author with me, has gone through a deeper analysis here, the general linear model analysis. The point of it all is, look down the bottom here, he gets a probability of 1 in 10 to the third, that's 1,000, or 1 in 10,000 that the groups arose by chance. So it's not. Okay. Now that we have two significant groups, what is the significance of this distinctness? And I'm going to give you a long list of significances here. Okay. Number 1, all fragments came from Oswald's rifle. That's because the little fragments match chemically with the big ones, and the big ones have ballistic engravings on them. Right? 2, Oswald's rifle was fired that day. This is the only way I know of to determine scientifically that the rifle was fired that day. And the way you do that is, again, to look at these two groups. Each group has a big fragment, the stretcher fragment, for example, in the group on the left, and the wrist fragment. The stretcher fragment might have been dropped on the stretcher by somebody. We'll grant that. But the wrist fragment got put into the custody of the FBI immediately in the hospital. And the same thing happens in the other group on the right with from the headshot. The large fragment found in the front seat, somebody could have dropped that in the front seat maybe, but not so for the fragments from the brain. So they all match. So that validates everybody by doing it this way. 3, no fragments or cartridge cases were planted. Same basic argument here. Number 4, must have been a forward snap. How do we know that? Because both bullets come from Oswald's rifle to the rear. And when a bullet hits from the rear, it has to snap the head forward. The question is how much? Okay. For anyone who doubts the reality of the head snap, please watch this. This is an animation prepared by a colleague of mine. We'll go through this a couple times. Alexander Dort in Brussels. Watch Kennedy's head. This is 310 to 316 or something. Watch Kennedy's head with respect to the other heads. This is a tenth of a frame. Everybody else is rock solid. Kennedy's head goes forward. Five. This predicts the proper speed of the forward snap. If you know the incoming properties of the Mannlicher-Carcano bullet, mass, velocity, you know its momentum, you know how much is going to be imparted to the head, you know how much a head weighs, you can calculate how fast the head must snap forward, and that's exactly what you see in the Zapruder film, about 3 feet per second or so. 6, the big rearward lurch does not come from the frontal hit. It come from a frontal hit. The reason is the bullets, all the evidence is that the two bullets it hit come from the rear. The lurch has properties which I don't have time to go into today. The timing of the lurch has properties of something other than a bullet. Number 7, renders the locations of the entrance and exit wounds to JFK's head moot. The reasoning here is very simple. You know the shot started from the rear because of the engravings. You know it passed through the head because of the chemical match between the head fragments and the larger fragment, and the fragment wound up in the front seat. Starts in the depository, Oswald's rifle, passes through the head, winds up in the front seat. We, for most purposes, don't need to know more than that. Same thing happens for the back wound, but the reasoning is a little bit more involved. We have CE-399, which started out in Oswald's rifle, and we know it started out that day. It left its telltale signature in Connolly's wrist as it passed through, and it wound up in Connolly's thigh, which is in the front of the car. Renders the offset of the holes in JFK's clothing moot. Same reasoning as above. One bullet passed through the body. Right? The offset of a few inches doesn't matter. Right? 10, invalidates all conspiracy theories with other shooters or planted bullets, and I'm going to show you that in just a couple minutes. 11 leads ultimately to the best shooting scenario, in our opinion at least. First shot is an early miss, 150 to 160 or so, missed and hit the street or the grass. Rushed shot, his car passed under the tree. Second shot, around 222 to 224. Passed through boatman and recovered as TE-399. Third shot, 312 to 313. Exited as 3 large fragments, 2 of which were recovered from the front seat, the third of which passed over the top of the windshield and down to Teg. Larry Sturtevant has a proprietary ballistics program that he sells for thousands of dollars that can simulate as well as possible the movements and the curvature of movements, a potential curvature, I should say, of large fragments of lead. And everything works out. It is entirely possible to get a bullet just over the top, a fragment, I should say, just over the top of the windshield. If you look, it's even in Josiah Thompson's book, the depository, the location of the limousine at 313, and Teg line up within a few degrees. And the ballistics and the mechanics work out for that too. And lastly, brings Oswald much closer to the crime. His rifle did it all. His prints were found on the rifle in the boxes. His clipboard, his paper bag, his backyard photo, his flight from the depository, his killing of Tippit in cold blood, and his attempt to kill again in the Texas theater. In summary, the physical evidence from the neutron activation and the fragments in the ballistics show that two bullets from Oswald's rifle did everything that day. Now, let me talk about chance matches, because this is going to come up later. Okay? If you know the underlying distribution of antimony in the Mannlicher-Carcano bullets, you can estimate the chance, for example, that the wrist fragment, the thing that is alleged to be the wrist fragment, could have been an accidental or chance match with CE-399. You can estimate that in a very straightforward way. The answer turns out to be level 1 here, 2% to 3%. For one fragment, assume the best that a conspirator could do, picking out Mannlicher-Carcano bullets, only a probability of a chance match of the highest you can get is 2% to 3%. And that's with the same kind of bullet. If you use another kind of bullet, but still with antimony in it, that drops down by a factor of 10 to 100, or down to 1 part in 1,000 to 1 part in 10,000. If you use a bullet with pure lead cores, it becomes essentially 0. If you consider 2 random matches between little fragments and big fragments, you just square the answers you get in the previous one. The 2% to 3% becomes 0.4% to 0.9%, and on it goes down like that. If you consider 5 random matches, which not too many people propose, but for the sake of argument, then it drops down to basically 1 part in a million and that's the highest you could get, 1 part in a million that these arise by chance. Larry Sturtevant has been able to do something here that I don't think anybody else has done, and that is mathematically to eliminate the most popular conspiracy theories, the ones that involve other shooters on other fragments. That's a huge achievement. I'd like to spend the second half of this talk on some recent objections that have been raised by Stu Wexler. Those of you who have been following the goings-on of this business for the last 3 years know that every time I go somewhere to talk about the neutron activation, Stu pops up. Every time I write a message to a news group, Stu writes a message in return. To try to describe this feeling to you, I want to give you a quote by George Miller from Harvard University many years ago, in March 1956, in Psychological Review, where he's talking about, this is an introduction to his article, where he's talking about the 7 plus or minus 2 slots in short-term memory available in the human brain, which is a very important thing for linguistics and principles of reading comprehension and so on. Where he says integer, just substitute Stu Wexler, and this is what's been going on. My problem is, I'm just going to read this to you now, just for a second. My problem is that I have been persecuted by an integer. For 7 years, this number has followed me around, has intruded in my most private data, and has assaulted me from the pages of our most public journals. This number assumes a variety of disguises, being sometimes a little larger and sometimes a little smaller than usual, but never changing so much as to be unrecognizable. The persistence with which this number plagues me is far more than a random accident. There is, to quote a famous senator, a design behind it, some pattern governing its appearances. Either there really is something unusual about the number, or else I am suffering from delusions of persecution. Okay? Let me give you a couple of examples. I'm not going to dwell on this, but some of the statements that have been put forth in the past couple of years. November 30th on AAJ stands for the news group Alt Assassination JFK. Larry and Ken, Larry Sturtevant, both need to actually acquaint themselves with the literature on the subject before they respond. They made fundamentally wrong assumptions before they did the work. They flouted convention. They failed to go to actual forensic chemists, blah, 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 blah. Next one. It is difficult to argue with people who assume that they are right and remain willfully ignorant of up-to-date published material on protocols, conventions, and statistics. Third quote. What Ken cannot deny is that his entire case rests upon an edifice of junk science. Without any primary sources, without any background in the statistical arguments being brought against the entire science as a whole, Larry and Ken have put forth a contrived scenario where Oswald had the unfortunate luck of choosing the only known brands of bullets exempted from the National Academy of Sciences report. Fourth quote and last, Ken knows full well that his own analysis flies completely in the face of the last 10 years of best practice in the area of comparative bullet-lead analysis. You would think, with this kind of noise, that there would be something behind it. I'm going to show you that there isn't. Okay? So let's review in a few minutes now Stu's core objections to the JFK analysis, neutron activation analysis, and why they're wrong. First, they are based on a 2004 report entitled Weighing Bullet-Lead Evidence by the Committee on Scientific Assessment of Bullet-Lead Elemental Composition Comparison, National Research Council of the National Academies. This report deals with composition analysis of bullet lead used to examine potential links between bullets or fragments from crime scenes and boxes of bullets found elsewhere in the possession of a suspect. Okay? The findings of this Academy panel can be stated very briefly. The links are often overstated, procedures and interpretations need to be tightened, but the technique itself, CABL, is still useful. Stu's objections center on 4 things, and I'm going to take up each one of these things very briefly. The viability of this basic technique, the scenarios for using it, the JFK bullet leads, and the resulting statistics. Viability. Stu says CABL, comparative analysis of bullet lead, is a failed technique. The report that he uses says something rather different. In many cases, CABL is a reasonably accurate way of determining whether 2 bullets could have come from the same compositionally indistinguishable volume of lead. Very different. Stu, Vincent Gwynne's legacy is essentially going down the toilet. A member of this committee told me in February 2004, bluntly, this report should not affect Vince's legacy. Stu, at its more recent incarnation, the requirement is at least 7 elements, but the report says, although little power to detect matches would be lost if silver or bismuth were dropped from the analytical procedure using ICP-OES, no time or effort would be saved by measuring 5 rather than 7 elements. They really don't care. The last 2 elements don't matter. And you can see this in detail in a little table from the report. This is table 2.4 from the actual report. This is the percentage of variation or the discriminating power of groups of elements. With 3 elements, you get 83% of the total. 4 elements, 96%. And after that, the last 3 elements you add, copper, bismuth, and silver, you only go up by 2%. I say three elements, or maybe 4 elements, are really all you need. And the committee's remarks are very similar to that. Point 2, scenarios. Stu says, there's absolutely no difference between conventional CABL and its application to the JFKs, but in fact, there is a very important difference. CABL, as talked about in the report, considers a broad question, matching bullets or fragments from the crime scene to boxes of bullets found somewhere else. The JFK NAA is much more constricted. It is narrow. It focuses on bullets and fragments from the same crime scene. The JFK situation is much tighter and much stronger conclusions can rightly be drawn from it. The JFK equivalent to CABL, which of course we're not doing, is collect 1 or 2 fragments from the crime scene, find Oswald's box of bullets somewhere, analyze them both and compare the compositions. That's not what's going on here. Bullet leads. Stu says, MC bullets are not unique. The reality is, Mannlicher-Carcano bullets, I should say, the reality is that these bullets are fundamentally different from the bullets considered by the National Research Council report. Okay? A couple of quotes and then some actual facts and data here. From the report, CABL assumes that a source of bullet lead is homogeneous. A source is a vat. It weighs tons. They give tables to back up this claim. I'm going to not go into details of these things, but let's work from the small scale up to the big scale and examine the scenario that the report is dealing with. First, within bullet variations, that means take a bullet, take the core, subdivide it, analyze them separately, and see if you find variations down the length of the core. They posit and show evidence that these variations within bullet leads, within cores, a couple percent. That's a pittance compared to what I'm about to show you. Here's another table from the same report. You look across the blue one, within bullet, from an 800 bullet subset, 5%, 2%, 2%, 4%, 5%. Very, very small. Variations within larger masses are also very small. Wires, slugs, and bullets. The extrusion process used to produce the wire from a bullet is thought to negate any inhomogeneity due to segregation. Coons and Grant have sampled wires produced from bullets and found the concentrations remain constant over several bullets. A bullet is a big slug that weighs hundreds of pounds. It's reasonable to assume that cutting the wire to produce the bullets and pressing the slugs to form the final bullets produce no substantial segregation of elements. On and on it goes. Okay? And we have some data for these larger masses. Within lots, Randich et al., 6%, 2%, 3%, 1%, 2%. Larger masses can become somewhat distinguishable, but they're still small compared to the Mannlicher-Carcano. Now I want to show you what the Mannlicher-Carcano data are and how different this stuff is. Okay? Here's a table I made up a few years ago. Look at the left-hand column. This is the 14 individual bullets, antimony in these bullets sampled by Gwynn. Antimony goes from 200 to 1,200 parts per million. That's a factor of 60, 6,000% if you like. Okay? Quarters of bullets. Look, they're almost as large variation. Only, large factors there too. Here is a comparison between Mannlicher-Carcano bullets on the left and the type of bullets shown in the NRC report. No comparison. Qualitatively different. CABL is homogeneous up to a melt, a few tons. Mannlicher-Carcano lead is heterogeneous within a bullet, but melts are indistinguishable, just the opposite. CABL lead becomes heterogeneous at 1 ton or more, whereas Mannlicher Carcano lead is heterogeneous at 1/10 of an ounce. You couldn't find things more different than that. Okay? Stu ignores this huge difference. We have absolutely no reason to think that these bullets are fundamentally different from any other bullet. Well, you just saw the data that refutes that. Okay? You have no primary source material whatsoever to support the notion of exceptionalism. Mocks the idea. Go on, let me skip over this. Randomness of bullets. Okay? Bullet boxes are essentially non-random samples mixed haphazardly, packaged conveniently, etc., etc. Let me show you the reality of randomness within Mannlicher Carcano bullets. Here are the 4 lots, each shown by a different color. The 14 bullets from the 4 lots. I would like you to note that the bullets from the red lot span the range, the bullets from the green lot span almost the range, the bullets from the blue lot span the range. The lots are indistinguishable. This is normal, okay? Let me just, summary of Stu's claims. They're all wrong. That's the summary, okay? What's going on here? What's the reason for this campaign? In a word, I will be brief, I know time is coming. In a word, Stu has a scenario that requires 2 Mannlicher Carcano rifles being fired from the rear. I won't give you that. He requires a second Mannlicher Carcano shooter from the rear, but he doesn't have any physical evidence for that shooter. Failing that, he needs a second rifle from the rear, but he doesn't have any physical evidence for that. Failing that, he needs a third Mannlicher Carcano bullet. The only way, but he doesn't have the third bullet because the neutron activation does not allow that third bullet. There's only 2 groups. So he's got to drop in, he's got to show that one of the bullets that looks like it's in a group is not really in the group. So he invokes an accidental match from an undiscovered third bullet from an undiscovered second Mannlicher Carcano rifle fired by an undiscovered second shooter. All the claims are wrong. Okay? Final point. Our alleged inability to pass peer review. Is it any wonder these guys can't pass peer review? I've got a pretty darn good idea that he is being rejected and why. This is why Ken couldn't get published in a peer-reviewed journal if he started one himself. So I asked Stu. I said, Stu, if we get published in a peer-reviewed journal, are you prepared to publicly retract these claims? And we got the long answer, but basically it means yes. Okay? So I announced today that we have 2 peer-reviewed journals, 2 peer-reviewed articles. They are just out in the October issue of Journal of Radioanalytical and Nuclear Chemistry. That's a European journal. First one is Ron and Sturtevant, Part 1, data interpretation. Second one, Part 2, extended benefits. They contain the 2 analyses, the 2 groups, the uniqueness of antimony, the distinctness of WCC MC lead, Gwynn's conclusions, the problem of heterogeneity and its resolution, chance matches, all the stuff I talked about today is in those articles. It's all peer-reviewed. It's out for the world to see. Stu's going to talk. This is the last thing. Stu's going to talk for half an hour. I don't know what he's going to say, but if he says that CABL is dead, please remind him that's not what the NRC committee said. They still support it. If he says Gwynn's reputation has gone down the toilet, please remind him that's not what the committee member said. If he says you can't get a valid distribution from 14 bullets, show him we just did it. The four lots overlap. If he says MC bullets are no different from the others, remind him, show him that table of actual data that I showed. If he shows you can't eliminate an accidental match, I say, agree with him, but the chance is 2% at best. Okay? And then ask him whether he wants to base his whole theory on an idea that it's at least 88% certain of being wrong. If he says we can never get published, show him the 2 articles. If he says Oswald is unlucky enough to use super special ammunition, congratulate him for getting one right. Thank you.
All right, we're now going to have a period of questioning led by Professor Rohn, and then we'll have Stu Wexler respond.
Thank you. My, that light's bright. I thought I would start out, if I may, by asking Professor Rahm two brief questions of my own that'll take about a couple minutes for him to answer, and then turn it open to the floor to ask as many questions as rapidly as you can of Professor Rahm. And the first question I would ask him, after your long and scholarly study of the assassination and expertise in the various aspects of it, how many bullets were fired during the assassination?
Is this working? Yeah?
Yes.
Good. We have, the short answer is I don't know for sure. We have positive physical evidence for two, both from Lee Harvey Oswald's rifle. And by the way, I can't put Oswald's finger on the trigger, by the way. There's no physical evidence for that. But nothing has come forward. Nothing has been shown in the last 4 years that it was somebody else. Two from Oswald's rifle that did all the damage that we know about. As the Warren Commission said, the weight of the evidence from the 3 expended cartridge cases and so on, and the weight of the ear witness evidence is that there was a third shot. We happen to think that was an early missed shot from some other minor pieces of evidence. Whether there was anything more, I don't know. There's no evidence for it. So I say guaranteed 2 and a possibility of another one.
Thank you. Then my second question, also brief, has 2 parts. And the first part is relates to the chain of possession of the elements that you have under consideration. I spent a good deal of time on this general subject, and then the second question is, do you have all of the bulletry in your base? Are there any portions or pieces that are not in the base? For example, the Oliver bullet, or the Aldridge shot, or the Lester bullet, the Larrabee, and so forth? Or are you confident that you have all of those? So those are 2 questions: chain of possession and totality of the specimens.
Let me answer the second one first. Totality of specimens. Obviously, we don't have everything that might have been fired. The first missed shot, we have no record of, if there was a first missed shot. The line of fragments through the head, most of them were too small to be taken out by the autopsy physicians. They took out 2. Our default starting point has to be that those 2 are representative. If there was a missed shot, obviously we don't have a missed shot from the knoll, for example. If there was such a thing, I happen to believe that there's no solid evidence supporting it, but if there was such a thing, no, we don't have it. But missing evidence is inherently neutral. It doesn't tell you yes or no one way or the other. Our conclusions are to be based on the evidence that we do have, those 5 basic bullets and fragments that we do have and have been analyzed.
All right, and then the second part, on the chain of possession, the integrity of the chain of possession.
I know there have been a lot of questions raised about that. I would give a 2-part answer to that. The first part is, maybe neither part is going to satisfy many people in this room, but it's what I believe anyhow. The statements, some sworn by the people who handled CE 399, for example, there's mixed opinion. I happen to know and have some precedent that those things would be legally valid if it ever came to trial. So that's my first answer, which I don't think most people here will agree with. Second answer is that I think that is overridden by the neutron activation evidence of the chemical matches.
Okay. Thank you. So we'll open it to the floor, and what I thought we'd do, we'd start right down this side, and I'll call on Tink, and then you will take over, and you call the questionnaires as we go.
I get to do all this?
No, I'll do it.
That's all right. No, that's okay.
Tink, you have a question?
Yeah. Professor Rome, were you here this morning? Were you here this morning?
Yes.
Yes. Did you see the presentations of the 3 of us this morning?
Yes.
Certainly, as a point of personal privilege, since I found this forward movement or quantified this forward movement some 35 years ago, and I am now absolutely convinced it doesn't exist. And since you saw what David Wynn presented, namely that the forward movement is based on a mistaken interpretation of blurring, that blurring is what caused the alleged forward movement. Yet you continue to announce that you believe that the forward movement is enormously important. Why do you go against the analysis of David Wynn?
Because I rejected it.
Very simple. Because you can just look and see it. You can just look and see the forward movement. We know there must be a forward movement because we know the head was hit in the rear. We know roughly what that must be. If you just look at the Zapruder film, the little animation that I showed, Kennedy's head goes forward and the others remain essentially rock steady. So I disagree strongly with that. That's my answer.
You want me to call questions for you? You can sit down.
Professor Ron.
Okay.
This is a better microphone.
All right, okay. Second question?
I have a question for you.
Okay.
Professor Ron, have you ever had this thesis of yours evaluated by peer review? And has your paper been accepted or rejected by peer review?
Gary, the journal I just mentioned is a peer-reviewed journal. Both articles were submitted and accepted. That's the answer to your question.
Articles are going to appear.
They have appeared. They are out now, just now.
Do we have a copy of them?
No, because I don't have a copy of them yet. They haven't. We've ordered. That gives me a chance to say something else. Larry and I have ordered a large quantity of reprints of each of these, something like 300 of each of them. Anyone will get them. Typically, we'll get them a few weeks after they appear. They appeared somewhere now in the second half of September. Anyone who gives me a business card afterwards, or gives me a piece of paper with their name and mailing address, we will send you a copy of each of those articles.
Now, Larry Sturtevant also had a letter to the editor published in Neurosurgery, and a very complimentary letter to the article that Michael Levy had written in Neurosurgery. It was very apparent to me, somebody who spoke here yesterday, and perhaps to you sitting in the audience, that Michael Levy, a well-intended, honest, sincere neurosurgeon, excellent, no doubt, in what he does, knows nothing about the Kennedy case and made huge errors in his paper. Dr. Sturtevant here comments very favorably and makes no comment whatsoever on any of the myriad errors in the paper. One wonders whether Dr. Sturtevant is a detached observer in this subject, and whether this, whether.
So are you suggesting that because he didn't criticize Michael Levy properly, that he is not competent to write about this stuff?
No, what I'm criticizing is that, it's clear that he is not an objective observer in the sense that he is not capable of identifying very obvious errors that are right in front of him that everyone else is aware of,
so
including the errors that were in your paper.
So once wrong, always wrong, in other words.
No, I'm just saying that including errors in your paper, that one of the businesses that you didn't touch upon is the fact that as one of the primary, and you put it as a primary source of evidence, is the bent fiber evidence, which was debunked 25 years ago by the House Select Committee on Assassinations, and yet it still exists on your website today if we were to go to it.
Okay, score one for Gary.
Well.
All right. Now we'll go to the next question, going right down this side, and that's, I've forgotten your name. Oh. Right ahead of me, straight, with your hand straight up, yes, please.
Yes. Did you hear Dr. Thomas's presentation this morning, and do you reject that also?
Yes.
Both? On what basis? On what basis do you reject
The multiple studies that have shown that the tape was not recorded and that stuck microphone was not in Dealey Plaza. I don't want to get into all of this today.
Thank you. Right ahead of you, there's a question there on the aisle, if I may.
Yes. I have no problem with your analysis.
Thank you.
Or the way you presented it.
Thank you.
But I think that a couple of the slides implied something which I think is not true, and I think that it has caused a lot of problems on both sides of the aisle for 40 years. That is that I think what you have made a very strong case for is that there is no firearms evidence that shows a conspiracy, that all the firearms evidence shows that one man fired all the shots. But that is a very different thing from saying that there was no conspiracy.
I agree with you completely.
Yes, okay. Thank you.
My mind is open about the possibility of conspiracy, but it's not open, as Carl Sagan said, so far that my brains fall out. Right?
All right. Next row, right, 2 rows behind him, right on the aisle, please.
I'm handicapped by only having general physics in high school and college, but the one fact that impresses me is that the motorcycle cop on the left rear at the 8 o'clock position windshield was splattered with brain material and blood. You come across from the 8 o'clock position and you're at the 2 o'clock position, which is the grassy knoll. Simple fact.
Okay, I just ask you to remember that the phenomenon that shot material out of President Kennedy's head was from isotropic forces within the skull, forces in all directions, and that is not directly related to the direction of the hit from the bullet.
No, we have a few more questions here. To the left, may right here.
I can't see.
Second, yeah. Yes, you, please.
Yeah,
I've forgotten your name.
Krish
I'm
Pani.
sorry.
Krish Pani. Mr. Krish Pani.
From Boston.
Clarification. On the fragments that ended up in Governor Connolly's wrist, I know he took to the grave some portion of that. There were some that were taken out of the wrist and matched with the other side. How close were they in terms of the antimony in the areas?
Oh, really close. It was in a tight group. I don't remember the exact, but a couple % off or something like that. Really, really close.
Thank you. And right behind you on the aisle. If I,
about the, excuse me. I want to follow up on the gentleman's questions about the bullet fragments. One argument has been that many of the fragments were buried with Connolly that could have been taken from his wrist had Nellie given permission. And had these bullet fragments been removed from his wrist, that might have shown that there was too many fragments for a bullet that was nearly intact. And that's been one of the issues surrounding the assassination for a long time.
I agree about the might have, could have part of that. But these fragments were very tiny and they weighed only a very small amount. And when they're sliced that fine, their mass is a lot less than you might think just by looking at them. So I don't think that's a strong argument. But in any event, we don't have the fragments, and we can't. It's a neutral observation because we don't have the fragments.
Mr. Bradford.
Hello. I guess as a layperson here, I've heard a couple of scientific papers this morning. In the first, we have a variety of scientific corroborating evidence about a shot from the knoll, for instance. There's the acoustics evidence, the jiggle analysis, which matches it. I think there's other stuff not talked about, like the Willis photo, which matches frame 202, and never mind eyewitness testing, and so on and so forth. And I guess, and then there's another, your talk later on about the, a scientific approach which leads to a different answer. And so as a layperson, of course, you can be a little confused about this. I guess I would like to ask the question that, given that it's well established from a variety of sources that the executive branch of the government was hell-bent on proving that this was not a conspiracy from day one, that I guess what I'm trying to ask is whether your scientific analysis does or does not depend upon the chain of possession of the fragments themselves, and what the chain of possession is for those.
I think we dealt with the chain of possession question already. It's pretty strong in most cases. For CE 399, you can raise some questions, but the fact that it matches with the other fragments is very strong supporting evidence, in my opinion.
If I may just follow up briefly, I mean, doesn't the match depend upon, for instance, the fragments themselves not have been removed from 399 after it's in the government's possession, for instance?
Well, if you can show me some evidence that they were, then we can talk, but we don't have that now.
We we'll have a question right in the red shirt. I'm sorry, I can't see you.
Professor, you mentioned the Tague shot. Do you believe Tague was hit with the actual fragment, or hit with a piece of concrete, or?
I don't know. In the beginning, I think it was thought that an entire bullet went down there, but I really don't think, and I'm getting most of my understanding about this from Larry Sturdivant, who, that was his career, ballistics and moon ballistics and biophysics and so on. But it appears that a large fragment going fast enough could either nick the cheek directly or hit the curb and spray something up. But the fact is, we don't know what exactly the details were, and we probably are not going to know. We do know, however, that not all that the head bullet fragmented into most likely 3 large pieces, of which only 2 were found. The 2 that were found hit near the top of the windshield, dropped back down into the front seat, a little higher trajectory by one of them at the speed at which we presume they were going the direction was right. It could easily have carried it down to Teg and done the damage down there. It's a little bit speculative. I can't prove this.
Well, thank you. We have one more question, and then Mr. Lazar.
Yeah, Dr. Ron, you made the statement that it didn't matter where the bullet entered the rear of the head. Did you attend the George Lundberg School of Forensic Pathology?
The answer to your question is no and no. I didn't quite make that statement that you said, and I've never met George Lundberg, and I don't think I would not call him a friend of mine to follow that logic. But for most purposes, if our approach to the assassination is to circumscribe it and progressively tighten what we know about it, then the main thing, I think, is that you know that the bullet came in, passed through, and exited. And the details of how this, it's interesting to know. Everybody wants to know this, of course, but I don't think they're material. So my original comment was, if I remember correctly, more for most purposes, you don't really need to know this.
Well, actually, for this case, you do, because there is a 6.5 millimeter fragment of lead in the top rear of the head, which I conclude came from a shot from the front, as did other metal fragments which were present in a corner of skull removed from the head. Now, can you tell me that those fragments were not deposited by a second bullet?
If you show me some positive chemical elements, chemical information on that. First of all, I will state up front, Randy, I don't agree with you on this.
No, I'm just saying, can you prove by neutron activation analysis that those metal fragments are not related to the other head bullet?
If we don't have the metal fragments, I mean, if you get the metal fragments and analyze them in principle, you can reach some sort of decision about that. But the fragments that are available, those 5 fragments that we have in evidence right now, there is the best you can say, or the worst you can say, is that there's a 98% probability that they came from only 2 bullets.
So your answer is no.
I'm afraid we have to call it to a close. We have one point here on recent research that has to be made at this time, I believe.
Just 2 quick questions. One, my understanding is that the neutron activation analysis of the smear on the curbstone where Teg was standing was nil, right?
I don't believe that material was ever analyzed by neutron activation.
There was an attempt made, and the result is nil. Now,
it wasn't done.
Secondly, I forgot my second point. Oh, yes. Are you aware that after his testimony before the House Select Committee, Dr. Gwynn was asked about the nature of the samples he had tested, and he said that they differed in size, shape, and appearance from the original specimens?
Yes, I'm aware of that. I wish I had.
How can you have any reliance in Gwynn's study in view of that?
That's easy because these things they represented different aliquots, right? And the larger fragments get made smaller by cutting them pieces off.
We don't know why they got smaller, do we? We just know they're different.
Large fragments are subdivided for neutron activation analysis because you require only a small amount. They also get a little bit smaller in weight because they have to be cleaned and scraped before they're analyzed. There are perfectly valid, non-conspiratorial reasons for changes. Changes in mass in the decreasing direction always.
But do you have any empirical data that shows that that is what caused the difference in size, weight, and shape?
Probably not.
Okay, that's
Thank
it.
you very much. Before we go on to Mr. Wexler, we have a brief, I guess you would call it interlude, by Dr. Aguilar.
I need a couple minutes to sit down. Yeah, it's in the back here. It's right here.
Yeah, good. Okay, good. Then let's put this on.
Can I keep this afterwards?
I'll give you this. Not the whole jump drive, but what I want to talk about right now, and I think that there's some importance here, is that Dr. Ron has long maintained that the chain of possession. You want to just to get to exit. See, there's a jump drive. It recognizes it already.
All right. I got to get away from
this. Dr. Ron has long maintained the chain of possession of 399 is a solid one. It would stand up in a court of law. That we have no reason to suppose that there's any problem with the chain of 399. And yet what I'd like to present very briefly here is that, in fact, we have serious problems with the chain of possession of 399. And, in fact, the reason to suppose that the bullet that was analyzed perhaps for these studies and the one that is perhaps in evidence now was not the bullet that was found on the stretcher in Dallas originally. As soon as my...
There you go. Just click
where is
magic
bullet? Here we go.
It has to open the program. It'll take a second.
So, if I may, this will come up in just a moment. The basics behind this is that in Parkland Hospital, a couple of employees, a fellow named Tomlinson, a fellow named Wright, found a bullet on a stretcher, called around, got a Secret Service agent to come around. They gave it to the Secret Service agent named Johnson, Johnssen, and that Johnson took the bullet over to his the chief of the Secret Service, Mr. Rowley, and he gave it to the FBI. The question is, was that bullet found there? And which one of these do I need to click? Here we go. It's this. All right. In any case, was Commission Exhibit 399 really found on a stretcher at Parkland Hospital? Now, initially, there is a Warren Commission document, which I'm going to show you in a minute, called Commission Exhibit 2011, which is 2 out of 3 pages of an FBI letterhead memorandum dated July 7th, 1964, from the Washington field office to the Warren Commission, saying that an FBI agent named Bardwell Odom had carried the bullet back to establish the chain of possession to Dallas, and he'd carried it around to show it to the individuals who had had it in their possession, Tomlinson and Wright. And that Tomlinson and Wright had not put their initials on it, but he said, according to this letterhead memorandum, that the bullet resembled the bullet they had found that day. Perfectly reasonable to assume that perhaps that meant that it was probably the same bullet. In any case, there was no real reason to question that until about 2.5, 3 years later, when Dr. Thompson here rolled back around to discuss this issue and talk to Tomlinson and Wright. Tomlinson was quite nervous then and gave equivocal answers, but Wright was very forthcoming and straightforward. And when he came to talk to him about it, Tomlinson walked back, or Wright, who was then personnel director at Parkland Hospital and had a lot of experience with firearms, walked back into his office and he said, well, you know, it had a pointed tip. And Thompson said, pointed tip? And he says, yeah, hang on a second. And he sat down, pulled out of his desk, and put the bullet that you see in top right there on the counter and said, this is what it looked like. Thompson then showed him the bullet to the bottom right, and he emphatically rejected that that was the bullet that he saw that day. Now, that was in 1966, not too long after the events that are under consideration. In any case, went the wrong direction, sorry. Now, this is what the Warren Commission report says, that the nearly whole bullet was found at the stretcher, And it was determined in both investigations, both Warren Commissions and the House Select Committee on Assassinations, that the bullet that was found in the Parkland Hospital had been from a rifle found in the depository. I mean, there was no question on either sources that this bullet was the right bullet. Now, we don't need to go through this. This is 399. That shows how it's been flattened. The whole theory was that it went through Kennedy and Connolly and caused all of both men's non-fatal wounds, 7 wounds in both men. Here is Commission Exhibit 2011, in which, if this will advance, it's being slow. Here we go. Here is 2011, and it says, if you'll read the top one regarding Daryl Tomlinson and O.P. Wright. I wouldn't mind having your pointer if you have it back, Tink. That Tomlinson stated that it appears to be the same one found at the hospital carriage at Parkland Hospital. This is taken directly from this letterhead memorandum, which Dr. Ron was passing around a few years ago. O.P. Wright said the same thing. Slug shown to him at the time. It looks like the slug found at Parkland Hospital. They didn't initial it, okay? Special Agent Johnson, however, said he could not identify this bullet as the one he obtained from O.P. Wright. I apologize about the poor quality of the typing here, but this is a high-quality resolution of a not a very good original in the Warren Commission volumes. If you look at the original, it's not very clear. That's what it looks like. It's not very clear. In any case, the same thing about Chief Rowley. Like Special Agent Johnson, he said he could not identify the bullet. Said nothing about, well, it resembled it. He just said he could not identify it. Well, that's where it lay. We have the good FBI evidence from Bardwell Odom, an FBI agent in Dallas, that he had gotten these guys close to the event saying it looked like the bullet they have. And, of course, now we have Tink Thompson saying that, no, that's not what it looked like at all. And there the story lay until the mid-90s when I decided to look back into it and enlisted Tink Thompson's help. Here's the 3-page FBI letterhead memorandum that Dr. Ron had been passing around in the mid-90s, from which these 2 pages comprise Commission Exhibit 2011. And so here we go. This is a FBI letterhead memo, and this is this page here, and that's that page here, and it says the same thing that I just showed you in the previous slides, that they said that they saw a resemblance. It appears to see the same one, Tomlin says. Wright says, Bardwell Odom said, looks like the slug we found. Johnson says they could not identify this. Rowley says he could not identify this. Well, then all of a sudden, secret documents start pouring out from the work of the Assassination Records Review Board. And I direct your attention to the bottom paragraph here, which I'll blow up. This is from the SAC in Dallas to the FBI field office to the director, going right to Hoover. And let's blow this up right here so we can see this in greater detail. Now, this is regarding the FBI agents going back around to establish that chain of possession, presumably Bardwell Odom. For information, neither Daryl Tomlinson, who found bullet at Parkland Hospital, Dallas, Texas, nor O.P. Wright, personnel officer at Parkland Hospital, who obtained the bullet and gave the bullet to Special Agent Richard Johnson, can identify the bullet. Now, all you can see here is can identify. For information. So I put it together because it's on the next page of this memo. Neither one of these people can identify bullet. On 11/22/63, Rowley, Chief, U.S. Secret Service, Washington, D.C., gave this bullet to S.A. Elmer Lee Todd of the WFO, who on 11/22 took it to the FBI laboratory and delivered it to Special Agent Robert Frazier. Both Todd and Frazier identified the bullet by placing initials thereon. But you have now the internal record. The point here to make is that this is the record of that chain of possession. And nowhere in the original chain of possession does it say that these men saw that there was a resemblance in this bullet, or that a resemblance had been recorded by them. The original documents, in fact, imply that they could not identify it, end of issue and period. All right. And here is a once secret FBI report regarding Johnson and Rowley. And of course, here, if you focus in on that, and I have it typed up here, Richard Johnson and James Rowley advised FBI agent Elmer Lee Todd that they were unable to identify the rifle bullet C1 by inspection, and so on and so forth. So we have the situation where they can't identify the bullet. Tink Thompson says that it's a different bullet. Of course, Wright tells him it's a different bullet. So I called Bardwell Odom, and this is where the story gets very interesting. Tink said, why don't you call Bardwell? And I said, well, is he still alive? Well, let's find out. Tink knows how to find people. I'll tell you, in about 15 minutes, I had his home phone number. I wrote him a letter, followed it up with a phone call, and Tink Thompson and I went to his house and sat down with him and showed him the documents. But these are from a transcript of a recording that I keep, from when I called him after I'd sent him the documents showing that his name's on all these documents as having carried the bullet around. That's me, G.A. I sent you a letter 2 weeks ago, apparently. You went into Parkland Hospital and showed a couple of employees there, and then he interrupted me. He said, oh, I never went to Parkland at all. I don't know where you got that. Well, one of the documents said that. Bardwell Odom took this bullet around and showed it to a couple of people. I didn't show it to anybody at Parkland. I didn't have any bullet. I don't know where you got that from, but it's wrong. So I asked him, oh, so you never took a bullet? You were never given a bullet? You're talking about the bullet they found at Parkland? Right. I don't think I ever saw it even. If you go back to this document here, now the other thing that we established after sitting with Bardwell Odom in his room, he said, look, if I'd gone around at that era and had that bullet and showed it around to these guys, you can bet I would have written a memo about it, even if now, and he was a very lucid guy, very bright, lucid guy. He said, even if somehow I'd forgotten having done that, which I don't believe I did, if I'd done that, I would have written a memo about it. There is no memo. This is the only memo that exists on this. And there's no memo that actually supports what the Warren Commission heard from the FBI. The FBI, my own view here, given the bias the FBI had toward the lone assassin solution, was that they gussied the evidence, and that the evidence underneath it does not support the chain of possession that Dr. Ahn has such confidence in. I want to thank you for your indulgence here. Yeah, I'm gonna. Let me just get rid of it. Gotta exit out of there.
Close it, and then we gotta, so the computer doesn't like it, we gotta do this little guy right there. Two arrows. Hit it. Hit it.
I'll hurt you.
We don't want to get a computer service. So I'm going to clear my stuff out of here. I'm going to give the floor to Stu.
We've run a bit over. I had promised Stu Wexler that he would have a half hour to respond to Dr. Rahn, and we will allow him to do that. That means that the lunch break is going to be cut short. We will run till 12:15 and take a lunch, and then at 1:15 we'll be back here for to hear David Talbot of Salon.com talk about the reaction of the high and the mighty to the Kennedy assassination. I now give you this number that's been following me around. I just found out its name is Stu Wexler.
I wonder if they're going to accuse me of being a prime number next.
Done this a million times. For those who are not PowerPoint savvy, let me tell you, the world has passed you by. I'm hearing some disgruntlements on the part of the senior leadership around here, but let me tell you, it's over, fellas.
Is it plugged in? I'll briefly explain it. For this microphone or this microphone? Hi, I'm Stuart Wexler. I'm the integer. I'm going to skip over these first frames pretty quickly because I think Professor Ron did a pretty good job of explaining the difference here. At issue with the NAA is the difference between 2 bullets and 3 bullets striking both men. That's the evidentiary dividing line in the Kennedy assassination for the past 40 years. Most of us, if we don't expressly know it, intuitively know it. 3 bullets hit the men, we have a conspiracy. This I do want to touch on briefly. It's why you need something like the NAA to prove the Warren Commission's point of view. Medical evidence. Why doesn't the medical evidence help us decide? Because it can only speak to 2 separate individuals. It can't tell you the relationship by itself of the wounds of each man to each other. The Zapruder film. I think Professor Rohn and I would agree that the Zapruder film is pretty convincing evidence of a conspiracy, but we're not going to convince Professor Ron because there's just not enough detail in the Zapruder film, and there's just too much controversy over eyewitness testimony to settle the issue. Some of you have seen these trajectory analyses on ABC where they do straight line and show that the single bullet theory can work. That doesn't work either because that plays connect the dots with bullet wounds. You have to dissect the path of each bullet wound before you can determine a trajectory. Because the autopsy was so sloppy, we don't have that information. So you turn to something like the NAA. Can you, as Ken Ron says, associate the little fragments with the big fragments and conclude that there are 2 and only 2 bullets? I'm going to skip over this really quickly. Key points here are Q1 and Q9. Those are the single bullet, the famous single bullet, and the alleged fragment recovered from Governor Connolly's wrist. CBLA is comparative bullet lead analysis. According to Professor Ron and Dr. Gwynn, this is what you get when you group bullets according to their chemical profiles. 2 distinct groups, 2, and the emphasis is on the word only. That's going to become important later. Only 2 bullets, all from 1 rifle, single bullet theory confirmation because of the group there on the left. Is there an alternative explanation? I don't know if this was adequately explained, so let me give you a graphical representation. Imagine for a second you get these same 2 groups. I don't dispute the 2 groups, but in reality, one of the 2 groups is 2 distinct bullets. The Q9 fragment in this case comes from an entirely separate Carcano bullet. Now, you say to yourself, well, how absurd is it that two people would use Mannlicher Carcano rifles on the same day of the assassination? It's not absurd at all. If you think about it from the perspective of a coordinated conspiracy, if you go into Dealey Plaza with a 45, a 22 caliber, whatever kind, all different kinds of rifles and ammunition, you're setting yourself up for a manhunt. Because a police officer, by sight, on a crime scene, can tell the difference between a 45 and a 22. So you're going to want to coordinate your ammunition. It's not rocket science, and it's not absurd. Why should we consider the alternative? Well, we have the statements of Mr. and Mrs. Connolly insisting that the governor were hit by separate bullets. We have the Zapruder film, which suggests two separate shots. I would encourage you to read Professor Rohn's analysis, because I agree with it 100%. And you have the condition of CE 399 strongly mitigating against it having struck Governor Connolly's wrist. This is the age-old argument. What I always look to is the initial reaction of the wound ballistic experts on the Warren Commission when they were given CE 399, that 4 of them were asked to comment. And this is before politics has entered into the sway, before you know what the implications are of saying, this bullet couldn't have hit the wrist. 3 of the 4 were positive that this bullet could not have struck the wrist and deformed the way it did. Now, their opinions changed once politics entered into the fray, but their initial reaction, I think, is instructive. Experts who saw that bullet and were told it hit a wrist were convinced that it couldn't have done it, the vast majority. Is Dr. Ron's work strong enough to convince a reasonable person that those doubts I just expressed are unwarranted? I have a picture of blood here up on the board. And within Professor Ron's presentation, I think people might have lost what the key assertions are by the National Academy of Sciences. What was once the long-held opinion about Mannlicher or any bullet lead was that it had a unique profile. It was like DNA or something close to. What the National Academy of Sciences has said, and I'll go into this a little bit more depth, is it's like blood type. Thousands of potential people can share the same blood type, and that has enormous implications I'll explain. First question you might want to ask is CBLA strong at all? And again, by trying to, point me to the extreme end and not give a full fleshed out view of what my points are, it's easy to think, oh, I think it's a completely dead science. It's not dead. What they're saying is that you can't match a fragment to a box. Now, here's just a little piece of logic for you guys. If you can't match a fragment to a box, and you can't match a fragment to and you can't say anything beyond this bullet might have come from thousands of other bullets, how can you possibly say that a fragment came from a bullet to the exclusion of all other bullets? Take a look at this chart here. It's a chart of where Dr. Gwynn was at, Dr. Ron has been at, and where modern science, the National Academy of Sciences are at. It's important to note that Dr. Ron has not analyzed any bullets himself. His work is derivative of Dr. Gwynn's work and the FBI. It's important to understand. Yet when Dr. Gwynn in 1978 looked at the issue and was asked the question, what makes up a bullet's chemical profile, he said at least three elements. Now, there's a trick to that, because in reality he only asserted that 2 matched, because copper was vastly different between Commission Exhibit 399 and the wrist fragment. And there's another catch, because when he asserted this to the House Select Committee in 1978, the figure he gave for silver was actually something that would have grouped the fragment with the head shot, not with the wrist shot. He changed that 5 years later. Professor Ron is familiar with this particular dilemma. So Professor Ron argues that you're okay to use 1 element. And I noticed something in his chart. He had 3 elements, he had 4 elements, he had 5 elements. There wasn't a chart up there for 1 element. And there's a very good reason why, and you're going to see what other chemical experts say about using 1 element to make your assessment. His statistics is based on 1 element. He can only conclusively claim that 1 element matches, and that's antimony. Modern science says at least 7. That's in their conclusions, folks. They say at least 7 was their recommendation for anybody making an assertion in a court of law. Now, maybe 5 diminishes it to 86%. We don't know what 1 diminishes it to, because they weren't even going to consider something that absurd. What can a forensic scientist do with their data? This is the key issue. Professor Ron and Dr. Gwynn both say that you can take a fragment, match it to a bullet, and reliably say that the rest of the bullets don't match this fragment. Other bullets in a box don't match it. Other bullets in the population, very unlikely that they match it. Now, when Dr. Ron put up the sign, the sort of gotcha moment about the matching of the fragments to a volume of lead, he didn't tell you what a volume of lead meant. Volume of lead means thousands, tens of thousands of potential matching bullets. And that's on a 7-element profile, not a 1-element profile. 7. To give you an idea of what that means, I wanted to go back to the idea of discriminants. Imagine I had a car, a witness to a getaway car, and all he told me was that the car was blue. Potentially thousands of cars would be included in that search. If he told you the car was blue Toyota, now you get to narrow your search down. If he said it was a blue Toyota 1994, now you can narrow it down even more. When you're going down to something like 1 element, you're talking about blue. You're not talking about a 1994 blue Toyota. So the potential to match thousands of other bullets is even higher in the analysis that has been presented to you. And finally, how strongly can you couch your conclusions? Dr. Gwynn said that you can have a high figure. In other words, you can say it's probably likely that this fragment came from this bullet to the exclusion of other bullets. Now, Dr. Ron, as you saw, he can say that there's something like a 98% chance that he's right. That's what he claims, and we're going to go into that. National Academy of Science says that you can't make any statistical claims. Any. We'll get to why in a second. This is something I would put up for my kids in class to try and gear them for the rest of the class. So I'm going to say, bullets are to blood as a bullet's chemical profile is to what? Blood type. Why? Because unlike DNA, thousands of people can share the same blood type, just as thousands of bullets can share the same chemical profile. And as a note on that, my colleague Tom Pinkston, who's a chemist who has worked with Mannlicher-Carcano bullets and has analyzed them, first 10 bullets we've analyzed, 8 of the 10 had the same amount of antimony in them. They would completely fool an analyst by luck. If Tom and I were to go hunting and Tom were to pluck down those bullets and he and I were to take them without any concern about the chemistry and shoot at some deer, and Professor Ron or Dr. Gwynn were to go and perform a chemical analysis, he'd say there are only 2 bullets when there are 3. And more often than not. Because in that box of actual Mannlicher-Carcano bullets, from bullet to bullet, I don't care about intra-bullet, I care about from bullet to bullet, they match. And here's what Professor Ron has said. He has said that our case is different. We are looking at one kind of problem, and you guys, you're using the NAS, and you're using the NAS when they were looking at a totally different kind of problem. The argument is easily refuted, and I think because most people understand the difference between DNA and blood, I'm going to use that analogy again. Typically, a forensic chemist, like a forensic blood expert, tries to include or exclude a known specimen as having come from a potential donor. In other words, they look over here at this blood, and they see this suspect over here. Can we say that the suspect left blood at the crime scene? Note, if it were DNA, you can say 100% for sure yes. If it's blood type, you can say he could have left the blood at the crime scene. Similarly, with ammo and the kind of problem that the NAS looked at, they're saying, okay, we've got these fragments from a crime scene with a particular chemical profile. We have a suspect with a box of bullets. Could his box of bullets have contributed to the crime scene? Now, I'd point out again, they can't do that anymore. They can't do that with any reliability anymore. If you go into a court of law and you talk at the level of bullet boxes, you will likely have your testimony thrown out. That's according to the NAS recommendations. Now, here's the problem changed to what Professor Ron and others have said is a different set of problems. They are trying to count the number of bullets at a crime scene. This would be analogous to somebody looking at these blood puddles and trying to count the number of people who left their blood at the crime scene. But notice, when you're dealing with something as weak as blood evidence, you have an A positive and a B negative, 2 puddles. Nobody could say that it wasn't 2 people who left those A positive blood at the crime scene, because thousands of people share the same blood type. It's the same thing with bullets. If you have a profile of a bullet and thousands of other bullets were at the crime scene, thousands of other bullets can match the specimens at the crime scene, all you can say is there are at least 2 bullets. And that's an important distinction, because at least doesn't resolve the essential question of the Kennedy assassination. 2 bullets or 3 bullets. Now, maybe I'm talking out of my tail here. What do I know? I'm only a history teacher. Yeah, I collaborate with a chemist. Who am I to say? So I decided what I would do is I would go to actual forensic chemists and ask them the exact kind of question that Ron says is so different from what the NAS is analyzing. Maybe he's right. Maybe I'm completely out to lunch. It's a completely different set of circumstances. Even if you find only 2 groupings of antimony, which is what Ron focuses so highly on, what Professor Ron focuses on, the number of bullets may be higher. The conclusion should be there are at least 2 bullets. As far as reporting goes, I would think that I would conclude that X bullets were recovered from the scene, indicating at least X shots have been fired at the scene. An analyst can only figure out a minimum number of bullets fired by the suspect at a crime scene. Remember, the supposedly new, tighter scenario. They're all saying the same thing I am. At least, not only, at least. And that means that effectively the NAA can't resolve the very question it's being asked to do. And things actually get worse. Because as I said before, you're dealing in this situation with an assumption of a 7-element profile, or a 6-element, or a 5-element. You're certainly not dealing with a 1-element profile. And the analogy to blood works here too, because blood has a profile. It has 2 components. It has the ABO and it has the RH factor, that plus or minus. So you might be A positive, B negative. Let's say I went to that same crime scene and I was trying to count the number of people who left blood at the scene. But I got rid of the RH factor. What does that do when I lower the standard of profile? Well, now I can't tell if that bullet in the upper right corner, that pool of blood, is from an A positive or A negative donor. If the bottom left is A negative and the top right is A positive, then I have at least 3 people. Contrary, if it's A positive and A positive, I have at least 2. When I lower the standard for a profile, counting becomes that much more difficult. The exact problem that Gwynne is trying to address becomes even more complicated and less and more vague. And I'm not the only one who thinks that using 1 element is not a good thing. This is from a German forensic chemist who didn't tell me either way whether or not he would allow me to use his name, so I didn't. He said it is necessary to measure all minor and trace elements, the 6 elements chosen by the FBI, when he was talking to me about that issue of counting. Certainly 1 is not enough, especially if it's an alloying element. 3 is a minimum unless the attempt to show is that 2 samples do not match. 1 element is not enough. Too much is left to chance and serendipity. Remember, all the statistics that you were presented rely on 1 element. Measuring just 1 element is a very dangerous concept. I wrote to a court-certified NAA expert, somebody who actually goes to a court of law and testifies using NAA about bullets. I asked him the exact question that Professor Ron presents, even though I don't agree with all the elements. That B part about the independently showing only 2 bullets? I don't agree with that. But I asked him anyway. Would that allow you, would that permit you to reduce your standard? My response to lowering the bar as to the profile is no. And this is my favorite one. The one-element assessment is absolutely ridiculous. What makes this so key is that the person who did it is the only other person I know of besides my colleague Tom, who's analyzed Mannlicher Carcano bullet lead, and he is the only other guy besides Dr. Gwynn who's done it with NAA. He says using one element to distinguish them is absolutely ridiculous. Biggest problem of them all, the problem of bias sampling. Now, maybe the vat of bullet lead that gets sent out there produces bullets with a unique range of antimony from the tip to the bottom. But what Tom has shown is that bullets, even within the same box, can share the same levels of antimony, which is the only question that matters. If 2 bullets can produce a set of fragments that look like one, that's all you need. Well, it turns out that when bullet boxes are shipped, there is now an acknowledged bias in the distribution of lead profiles. In other words, if you ship bullets to Toledo, they might all look like Commission Exhibit 399. If you ship bullets to Dallas, they might look like something completely different, the bullet that shot General Edwin Walker. Everything in this, I can't emphasize this enough, everything that advocates have inferred about the population of Mannlicher Carcano bullets come from one man, John Nichols, and his 14 bullets. We do not know where these bullets were bought. We do not know, because we don't know about any manufacturer. This is one of the problems with bullet lead analysis as a whole. How Winchester specifically shipped them, because they don't pay attention, they don't care. And we do not know where Oswald bought his ammunition. What does this mean? And I'm going to explain this in a little bit of depth. The foundation of virtually everything that has ever been asserted about Mannlicher Carcano bullets and Mannlicher Carcano bullet boxes could potentially be skewed. And let me explain what I mean. That general linear model analysis, I invite you all to consult with any PhD statistician and ask them, if I have a biased sample and I cannot quantify the bias, can I infer to population reliably? You will be told no. It doesn't matter how sophisticated your analysis is, if you can't rely on your sample, if it's biased and you can't assess the bias, all of your inferences could be wrong, could be drastically wrong. Let me demonstrate this. Politics. We happen to know that political views tend to be geographically distributed as well, just like bullet boxes and bullet profiles. Now, let's suppose I did a focus group, and I didn't tell you from where. And it was on the Iraq War, and I said 65% of the people I analyzed in this focus group support the Iraq War. And then I went the next step and told you, I think 65% of the population of the United States supports this view. And I didn't tell you where these people were from. Now imagine what the implications were of that, not taking into account the bias. If they were from Crawford, Texas, I would say, well, I suspect that the rest of the country would probably have a considerably lower opinion about the war in Iraq. If they were from San Francisco, California, I'd be shocked, but I'd also say, well, now I would probably think that maybe 80–90% of the population supports the Iraq war, because we know what people in San Francisco tend to think, and they're largely in favor. If it was from Des Moines, I would say, well, maybe it is an accurate representation. But the key is, if I never tell you where they're from, you're never going to make a reliable determination about the rest of the population. Now again, I reemphasize, you can talk all you want about from tip to base of a bullet, but unless for some unknown reason that I've never heard of, you can tell me that they ship these bullets differently than every other bullet that's ever been shipped and analyzed, you're still going to fall at the feet of the geographic bias problem. And if you can't tell me anything about where Nichols bought those bullets and the kind of bullet boxes that were shipped there, that leaves open the potential that when whoever it was, let's say for the sake of argument, Lee Harvey Oswald, bought his ammo from where we don't know, got a box, it just happened to have a few extra bullets that would match Commission Exhibit 399. Not for any other reason than pure chance. But we can't assess that. There is missing information. Thought people might get a kick out of this. How many people here actually believe that I once dunked on Shaquille O'Neal? I bring this up for a reason. Theoretically, it's possible that I once dunked on Shaquille O'Neal. Theoretically, Spud Webb was 5'7" and he won the slam dunk contest, and Shaq, he plays pickup basketball with regular people, occasionally. Both things are incredibly rare. Both things don't happen very often. So when you combine them together, it becomes even more absurd. We're being asked by the Warren Commission to believe two freak events happened to the same man. A bullet strikes one of the hardest bones in the human body and emerges virtually intact after going through two people. And he happens to have a freak neuromuscular spasm later on in response to a shot from the rear. Two completely rare events. Now imagine if something happened to one of your relatives and somebody came to you and said, yeah, this is how it happened. One bullet went through two men, struck his wrist, and it looks like this, and he had a neuromuscular spasm. I submit to you that you would spend the rest of your life trying to figure out what actually happened. Whether you had positive evidence that it was wrong or not, you would know that it just doesn't fit right. It doesn't fit. And my question then is, if you were willing to do it for one of your own relatives, why does John F. Kennedy deserve any less? Thank you.
Okay, we have a couple of quick announcements by Natalie, and then we're going to have to take a very fast lunch break.
If you are a speaker or a panelist and I have not talked to you about your dinner attendance, please see me. And also, could Howard Arena, Dan Griffith, Brian Rooney, and Arpal Swickard please see me as well. The archives are also going to be open this afternoon until 7. And if you're interested in going there like tomorrow afternoon, please see me so we can get a feel for how many people would be interested. Thank you.
The jacket Q2, a fragment from the front seat cushion core plus jacket. Q4 and 5, Q lead fragments from JFK's head. Q9, 3 fragments from Connolly's arm, and Q14, 3 fragments from the rear carpet underneath Mrs. Connolly's seat. This is a little diagram of where they came from, and I think everybody in the room is familiar with this. So we will go on. These fragments were analyzed chemically 3 times, actually. The first time overnight on the night of the assassination by the FBI by optical emission spectroscopy. That failed because the technique was too coarse. They then turned to neutron activation, which was a technique coming into its own in those days. It was done first. It was done twice by neutron activation, first by the FBI in May 1964 for the Warren Commission, not publicized. It contained multiple systematic errors that Vincent Gwynne later discovered and resolved. The data were kept secret by the FBI, presumably because there was confusion as to what they actually meant. They did not, as seen then, show a clear story. Then for the HSCA in 1977, Dr. Vincent P. Gwynne of UC Irvine reanalyzed the fragments. This work, in contrast to the first set of analyses, was highly publicized, showed 2 clear groups of fragments, and ultimately agreed with the FBI's analysis. The goal of this work was very simple and limited. It was to try to determine how many bullets hit the men by seeing whether the little fragments, the tiny fragments, too small to have ballistic engravings, could be associated chemically with the larger ballistically engraved fragments. The result of this, as I will show in great detail, are two clear groups of fragments, each containing one big fragment and one or two little ones. This is positive evidence for two and only two bullets, both function. There's been a lot of conflicting evidence. And I think that's a natural result of the type of evidence that's being discussed and the type of evidence that's discussed primarily at these JFK conferences. But there's another way to look at the assassination, and that's through the lens of the hard physical evidence, the validated physical evidence. So I was sitting in the back the other day, I was thinking, thank goodness for the physical evidence, and thank goodness for the neutron activation that organizes the physical evidence. And this is what I'd like to show you in the next half an hour or so. My talk is entitled The Harmony of the Physical Evidence. The major physical evidence, major types of physical evidence are listed here. I can't discuss them all today. Rifle, bullets and fragments, neutron activation, cartridge cases, fingerprints, brown paper bag wounds, clothing, etc., etc. You all know these types of evidence. The physical evidence makes, when combined, a physical framework, a strong web that might better be called an impregnable wall. The neutron activation knits it all together. According to the words of my co-author, Larry Sturtevant, famed ballistician from HSCA days, the neutron activation is truly the queen of the physical evidence. It is the strongest physical evidence, the strongest new physical evidence to emerge from the HSCA hearings. Let me just quickly review with you the bullets and fragments. This is, by neutron activation, we mean chemical analysis of the 5 major bullets and fragments that were recovered from the crime scene and from the hospital. They're listed here. I think you all know them. The ones in light blue are the ones that do not contain lead, and so we're not talking about. But the 5 lead fragments, very briefly, are Q1, the bullet from the stretcher in the hospital, a core plus fired from Oswald's rifle. This is one of the strongest results from any of the physical evidence. Here's the summary of the FBI's original analysis and Gwyn's follow-up analysis. The FBI's data consisted of 4 replicate runs, and you can see the arrows pointing to them. Gwyn's analysis, a decade later, is the black squares in the middle. Now you see essentially 5 parallel lines here. 5 groups. The idea is you have to look horizontally laterally across each analysis, and you will see Q1 and Q9 on the left, which form a group at about, well, according to Gwyn's measurements, about 800 parts per million of antimony. This is the prime indicator element. And then you will see a group on the right containing 3 fragments, Q2, Q4, 5, and Q14. The group on the left is from the body shot. The group on the right is from the head shot. The point is, 2 analyses separated by more than a decade agreed with one another. They each gave 2 groups. The next question, a very important one, is are these groups distinct from one another? There are 4 ways to check this distinctness, and if we had time, and maybe in the questions we can go into this a little bit more. By the way, I'm going to solicit lots of questions from the audience today because we have an unusual opportunity here of interested people gathered together, and I want to make sure everybody leaves this room with a good basic understanding of what's going on here about the neutron activation and its power. So when I finish, I will take whatever questions you have on this, and I hope that you will leave with a good idea of what's going on. There are 4 ways to check the distinctness of the groups, the separateness of the groups. Number 1, just look at the samples. Number 2, look at the means and the standard deviations. These are increasingly complex. Number 3, test the difference of means statistically. And number 4, Larry Sturtevant, general linear model analysis.
First, I would like to announce for those of you who do not already know that we're being taped by C-SPAN today. It is not airing live, and we don't know yet when it will run, but we're very happy to have C-SPAN here. We've heard so far in this conference some rather amazing evidence which I feel strongly indicates, overwhelmingly indicates, the existence of shots from more than one location, which means a conspiracy. But there is a dissenter here who wanted an opportunity to express a dissenting point of view, and that is Dr. Ken Ron from the University of Rhode Island. He will now give his talk on the harmony of the physical evidence.
Thank you very much, Jim. I'd like to begin by offering my appreciation to Jim Lazar and the organizing committee for giving me a chance to discuss with you for a half an hour or so the neutron activation analysis and the power of this in looking into the assassination through a different lens than... No. Is this one? This one? This one? Oh, here it is. It's over here. Okay, thank you. I want to look at the assassination with you in a little different way. During the last couple of days, one of the speakers alluded to it yesterday, I believe, that there's been a lot of confusion. If we just look at this, just look at the samples. Here they are from Gwynn's results, which is probably the best set of analysis on this. The group on the left represents the body bullet, the stretcher and the wrist fragments. The group on the right represents the head bullet. You see the values are in the little circles, and you see 95% confidence limits. That's 2 standard deviations. The arrows up and down from there. The groups are separate. You can just see it. If you want to go a little farther, you can look at the means and the standard deviations of the fragments within each of the groups. When you do this, if you take the log scale here for doing this, and we'll show why we do that in a moment, here you see the top group and the lower group, and you see the means differ, and the standard deviations on each one. The means differ by 8 standard deviations. That huge. The groups are separate. If you want to go a little farther, you can test the significance of the means. In order to do that, you have to find the underlying distribution of the concentrations of antimony in Mannlicher-Carcano bullets in general. The way you do that is to use a set of 14 test bullets that Vincent Gwynn got from each of the 4 lots of Mannlicher-Carcano bullets that were manufactured by Western Cartridge Company. You first examine these for a normal distribution. This is standard statistical practice. When you do that, you put on a normal plot. If they are normally distributed, the points, each point represents a bullet here, will lie on a straight line. They don't. They fall off at the low end. This is not, the distribution is not normal. That shouldn't surprise anybody. Most things in nature are log normally distributed. We see this in almost anything in the real world is distributed logarithmically, not linearly. If we try log normal distribution, which is the standard statistical practice, next step from there